Hollywood is a town built on dreams, but for most, those dreams shatter quietly, far from the spotlight. Jake Collins was one of those dreamers. A young actor from Montana, Jake had moved to Los Angeles with a duffel bag, $300, and a dream inspired by old westerns he watched with his grandfather. He idolized Clint Eastwood, not just the actor, but the man. The lone rider, the quiet justice, the legend. Jake wanted to follow that path. But reality hit harder than he ever expected. For months, Jake lived out of his rusty Honda Civic, parked behind casting studios and fast food joints. Auditions came and went, always ending with rejection or, worse, silence. The city's coldness was unbearable, and Jake had reached a breaking point. He hadn't eaten a full meal in days and was down to his last $5. One rainy evening, soaked and exhausted, he walked into a small diner near Burbank, just hoping for warmth. That's when fate took a sudden turn. As Jake sat by the corner booth, shivering and watching the rain hit the window, a man walked in wearing a worn leather jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. The room changed. Heads turned, whispers followed, and Jake's eyes widened. It was Clint Eastwood. Not a poster, not a memory. The man himself. Clint, now in his 90s but still commanding presence like a true gunslinger, walked past Jake's table and paused. He looked down at the soaked, defeated young man and asked, with that familiar low voice, "You all right, son?" Jake could barely speak. Not from awe, but because this was the first time in months someone had looked at him and seen him. Jake could barely believe what was happening. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, was standing right in front of him, concerned, waiting for an answer. Jake stammered, unsure whether to lie or confess the truth. "Just a long day, sir," he said, trying to mask the hunger and exhaustion in his voice. Clint studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly like he had done in 100 Western standoffs. Then, with a simple nod, he gestured toward the empty seat across the table. "Mind if I sit?" Jake's heart nearly stopped. He nodded, and Clint sat down, signaling the waitress. "Bring the kid a hot meal. My tab," he said plainly, as if it were just another line from Unforgiven. Jake tried to hide his embarrassment as his stomach growled audibly. Clint didn't flinch. He simply sipped his coffee and let the silence settle, comfortable as ever. "What brings you to L.A.?" Clint finally asked. Jake hesitated, then sighed. "Acting. I thought I wanted to be part of the stories I grew up on, like yours." There was a brief pause. Then Clint chuckled, a low rumble that felt both amused and sympathetic. "Hell of a business to chase. Tougher than a desert shootout sometimes." Jake smiled weakly, unsure what to say. That's when Clint leaned in, voice soft but firm. "You got the look. But more important, you stayed. Most people quit before the first bruise. You stayed." The waitress arrived with a steaming plate of food. Jake stared at it like it was gold. As he dug in, Clint sat back, watching him with a calm, almost paternal presence. Jake didn't know it yet, but this moment would shift the direction of his entire life. Jake wiped his mouth with a napkin, still dazed by the surreal moment unfolding in front of him. Clint Eastwood, an icon, a legend, wasn't just talking to him. He was treating him like a peer, not a nobody. After a few moments of silence, Clint placed his coffee down and leaned forward slightly. "You know," Clint said, "I didn't get my first real break until I was nearly 30. Spent years doing background roles, bit parts. Hell, some days I wondered if anyone even noticed." Jake looked up, surprised. "But you're You've done everything." Clint smiled faintly. "Not without getting kicked around first. This town doesn't owe you a thing. But if you're stubborn enough, it might just let you stick around." Then, with that same matter-of-fact tone that made his on-screen characters so magnetic, Clint asked, "You got a headshot on you?" Jake blinked, stunned. Yeah, in my backpack." He reached down and pulled out a slightly bent envelope. Clint took it without hesitation and studied it for a moment. "You ever done stand-in work?" Jake shook his head. "Not yet." Clint nodded. "I'm directing a film next month. We need someone to stand in during pre-lighting. It ain't glamorous, but it's paid, and you'll be on set, watching." Learning Jake's jaw dropped. He couldn't speak. He barely breathed. Are you serious?" he managed to ask. Clint stood up slowly, leaving a few bills on the table for the meal. "I don't joke much, kid," he said, tipping his hat. "Be at Warner Lot, stage 12, Monday, 6 a.m. Don't be late." Jake sat there frozen as Clint Eastwood, cowboy hat and all, walked out into the L.A. morning light. He hadn't just met a legend. He'd been seen by one. Monday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy Jake hadn't felt since his very first audition in L.A. The sun had barely risen when he arrived at Warner Brothers' studio, clutching a borrowed coffee and wearing the cleanest outfit he owned. The air buzzed with the usual pre-dawn hustle of crew members, grips, and PAs, all moving with purpose. Jake felt like a speck in a massive machine, but a welcomed speck this time. He found stage 12 just as Clint had said. A production assistant greeted him with a clipboard. "You must be Jake. Mr. Eastwood said you'd be here early," she said with a smirk. "Follow me." The set was a detailed recreation of a rustic diner in the Midwest. Dusty booths, a squeaky door, even a jukebox that played old Johnny Cash. The lighting crew was already testing angles. Jake was guided to a spot with a chalk X on the floor and told to stand there while they adjusted key lights. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but it was everything to Jake. About an hour into standing silently under the hot lights, Clint arrived, calm, commanding, and sharp-eyed as ever. He walked the set with his cinematographer, discussing mood, tone, and shadows with a few brief words and a lot of purposeful glances. Then he noticed Jake. "Morning," Clint said, nodding once. Jake straightened. "Morning, sir." "You holding up?" "Yes, sir. It's an honor." Clint walked over and stood beside him, looking at the same camera angle. "You'd be surprised how many actors come and go. Think they're too good to start small. Think standing in isn't worth their time." He turned his steely gaze to Jake. "But you showed up." Clint called over the first AD and said something quietly. A few moments later, the assistant turned to Jake. "Mr. Eastwood wants you to read lines for one of the actors who's running late." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Lines? Yeah, just for blocking. Nothing final. You okay with that?" Jake swallowed his fear, nodded, and stepped up. This wasn't just standing in anymore. This was his moment, however small, to be part of Clint Eastwood's world. Jake stepped into the frame, the sides of the script trembling slightly in his hands. He stood across from the lead actress, heart pounding, as Clint Eastwood sat behind the camera monitor, eyes locked on every movement. The assistant director called for quiet, and the rehearsal began. Jake had read the scene the night before, just in case, but now, speaking the lines aloud in front of legends, he had to steady his breath. His voice cracked on the first line, but he recovered quickly. The actress smiled, feeding him the energy of the scene, and within seconds, Jake forgot the nerves. He was in it, focused, present, real. When the rehearsal ended, Clint slowly stood and walked over to the group. Everyone fell silent. "He's good," Clint said, voice rough but clear. Jake blinked, unsure if he heard right. "Let him run that scene again, cameras rolling this time." The crew exchanged glances. This wasn't planned. But when Clint Eastwood gave an order, it wasn't questioned. They ran the scene again, this time with real lighting, a close-up on Jake's face, and Clint watching like a hawk. When it wrapped, Clint approached Jake. "You came to set just to stand in," he said, "but you stood out." Then he handed Jake a revised call sheet. Jake looked down. His name was now listed not as stand-in, but as waiter number 2. A real role, a real credit. It wasn't the lead. It wasn't a dramatic monologue. But it was on camera, in a Clint Eastwood film. By the end of the shoot, Jake had exchanged numbers with the casting assistant. He got introduced to the producer. He even got invited to the wrap party. Months later, when the film released, Jake's scene remained intact. His friends spotted him in the trailer. His phone started buzzing again, not with sympathy, but with excitement. And in every interview Clint gave, when asked about giving new talent a shot, he'd mention a young man who showed up just to help, and ended up stealing a scene. That moment changed Jake's life. Not because Clint handed him a career, but because Clint gave him a chance to prove himself. And that chance became everything.